everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Szamotah and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, brother? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. Let me start by saying happy birthday, man. Thanks for being a trooper and deciding to record on your birthday.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, well, I'm a grown man, and once you get older, your birthdays become a little less special, so you don't need to really plan out some party or special event. We just ordered. I mean, I can't really do much anyway. I got the China flu.
Oh, geez. Hope you're doing okay.
I got the China flu. I'm doing okay. It's about time I got it. It's been 2 years of many close situations. I really thought I was of the immune, because I've been around a lot of people who've had it, and I've been to events where there have been outbreaks. So I figured at this point, it's been 2 years, I just wasn't going to get it. And then finally, I was at a wedding last weekend I was at a wedding, and there was a COVID outbreak. And a couple days later, when I found out that there was a COVID outbreak, I took a test. And, well, first, my Allison, she called me up while she was at work. She was freaking out. She's like, I have COVID. And it was a big deal because her bridal shower was this weekend, so she had to cancel it.
Oh, that sucks.
So I was like, fuck, I bet I have it too. So I took the test, because I woke up earlier that day and my throat was sore. So I knew it. I knew it right when she said that. So I tested positive, and I've been in quarantine ever since. I have to say, it's worse than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah?
I thought it was going to be just like nothing. That was my expectation.
Well, I'm glad that you're still alive.
Because I figured when I first tested positive, I was, my attitude was, okay, there's like no chance I'm going to have symptoms. It's just going to be like whatever. I'm going to quarantine so I don't get anyone else COVID or the coof. And, that will be that. But I did get at least a couple of symptoms, as far as like fever and like tight chest, all that shit. Al lost her smell and her
oh, that's scary.
Her taste. She lost her senses. I can't smell. So I don't know what version of the coof we got, if it's like the older version or if it's the Omicron, or what symptoms are which, but whatever. I'm still alive. Don't worry about me.
All right, man.
It's just the flu. I will tell you, I've had the flu a couple of times since we started the show. My flus were a lot worse than this. My flus were 10 times worse. There was a flu I got right before COVID, and everyone tells me it was COVID, but at least the flu for me was worse than a lot worse than the COVID.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're, not in a hospital somewhere. So that's all I got to say about that.
I appreciate that. No, I'm good. I'm getting better. I'm able to perform my podcast responsibilities and record another episode. And on today's show, and if I mess up anything today, I will be using COVID as a deflection or as an excuse for screwing up.
The COVID brain fog.
So if I get anything wrong, it was the COVID brain fog. Or if I misspeak, or if I use a lot of ums and buts and filler words, it will be because of the COVID brain fog.
And I'm going to use that same excuse too, even though I don't have it.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about Lend-Lease. That's been in the news a lot. And Congress has decided to renew the Lend-Lease Act. So we figured we'd just talk about the history of the Lend-Lease Act and do kind of a classic history episode and try to compare it to what's going on today. Does that sound interesting?
Yes, it does.
All right, cool. So we'll get right into it. So what is Lend-Lease? So Lend-Lease is one of those topics that is really up to dispute on how much it impacted World War II, the war effort during World War II, or if it impacted it at all. A lot of people say that the USSR would have lost World War II or without the Lend-Lease. And then some say it just reduced the time of the war by a couple of years. Now, I mean, I'm not really sure. It's so much. This is one of those topics of the financial aid. We're talking about the financial aid that the United States gave its allied partners during World War II. That's known as Lend-Lease, or this aspect that we're going to talk about is known as Lend-Lease, and what it was when the U.S. passed the Lend-Lease was a U.S. passed law in March of 1941 that provided financial assistance for governments fighting Nazi Germany, and then it eventually extended to the governments fighting Japan. So it extended to China as well. It started off with Great Britain and the European powers or the European partners, and then to China. And it was formerly known as an act to further the defense of the United States. Now, to give you some background, when World War II started in Europe, American neutrality laws stipulated that all sales of war supplies had to be paid for in cash and then shipped in foreign vessels.
Cash and carry.
Well, exactly. So by July 1940, France had surrendered, and Britain told the American government secretly that it was going to be impossible for them to continue to pay cash indefinitely. So Lend-Lease was thought up by the U.S. government after the British had ran out of money. Now, after the November election, the British situation was made public, and FDR requested Congress to pass an act that gave him power to lend war supplies to countries. And I quote, FDR quotes, "whose defense is vital to the United States." So FDR, he delivers this speech where he said something along the lines of, if our neighbor's house catches fire, we have to give him our garden hose, and with it he can put out his fire, or something like that. He uses that analogy of putting out your fire before it gets too crazy.
Which is also kind of a joke too, because the fire was like a 4-alarm fire, and we're offering a garden hose.
Yeah, a garden hose, right? Well, when our partners need a squirt gun, we're going to give them a squirt gun. I love how my Alex Jones voice is just my impression for everyone now. FDR impression? Oh, well.
I got the documents right here.
Pass Lend-Lease.
The British need money.
We got to pass Lend-Lease for the Allies. He basically says, the fire is going to extend to, our neighborhood. Now, the Lend-Lease, it included, everything that could be used for the war. So raw materials, semi-finished goods, military equipment, food. And after it ended, unused supplies were supposed to be returned. In reality, very little equipment was ever returned.
Yeah, I mean, how much aid did we end up giving them in total? Or how much aid did we give out?
So the total aid provided under this law exceeded $50 billion between 1941 and 1948.
Is that 1941 money or today money?
No, that's 1941 money. So I don't know what the comparison is. Off the top of my head, I don't know what the inflation transfer is, but it's many times over. I'm sure someone will look this up right now.
I could look for it. $1 is worth $19.67 today from 1941 to today. So rough math, 50 billion times, $19.67 comes to about $983 billion.
Okay.
That's a lot of money.
A lot of money. But hey, it was an expensive war. So Roosevelt declared openly that the USSR would have priority in it, which actually caused tension between Chiang Kai-shek and Britain, because they thought their support would be taken by the Soviets. So they, China and Britain thought that, or they feared that some of the support from the Soviet Union or to the Soviet Union would be allocated from them. But the reality was that the British received by far the most. So in In all, and I have the statistics right here. Sorry if my voice is crackling. Damn China flu. In all, 31.4 billion went to the UK, 11.3 billion went to the Soviet Union, 3.2 billion went to France, 1.6 billion to China, and the remaining 2.6 billion went to other allies. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at like a majority of American surveys, in the summer of 1941, they were against helping the Soviets. And one of the main reasons was, and this was one of the great fears, and this is what I would have thought back in those days too, that the Soviets would lose anyway. And all those weapons would be that were delivered to the Soviet Union would end up in German hands, which is entirely understandable because in 1941, the Soviets were losing entire armies on a regular basis during the first year of the war. You know, the Soviets, in 1941, the Soviets lost the 16th, the 19th, and the 20th armies when they were encircled and destroyed at the Battle of Smolensk. And then they lost the 6th and the 12th armies. It's about 100,000 casualties. And it's just the Battle of Uman. And also the Nazis were at Leningrad at this time. So, I mean, any observer of the war, I mean, I would have probably thought that the Soviet Union would implode, but they didn't. So, you know, public opinion starts to change because the Russians start hanging around and not imploding, especially after France fell. And, you know, all this led to a change in attitude both among the West and, you know, they were, you know, the Soviet Union's eventually included in the Lend-Lease program in November of 1941.
I think it's pretty interesting that you're saying like the political opinion, or at least the running opinion was that the Russians weren't going to win. And so giving a bunch of military equipment, resources and stuff to them was just kind of like a dumb idea because it would just go to the Nazis. They start hanging around, right? And they're not losing. So then we decide like, all right, let's go for it because they didn't fall. France fell and we decided to give it a shot. So I guess the question is, because we know how the history ends on this one, they didn't lose. They won. We won, really. So how much did this Lend-Lease impact the war in the East?
I don't really think there's a strong consensus on this. I think it's one of those like historical debates because I guess first and foremost, Lend-Lease started out really slow. And
yeah,
the Soviet Union,
just as all government programs do.
Yeah, well, the Soviet Union didn't see the immediate bonuses or you know, advantages of having Lend-Lease, especially in 1941. And a lot of, you know, different historians will place when the Soviet Union changed the tides of the war. Some historians, you know, a common point is Stalingrad. You know, it's where I think that's probably the most common point where people where you know, World War II historians or just World War II buffs in general will be like, okay, that's when the tide changed in the war and the Germans started losing. Other people say that the Germans started losing that winter in 1941, 1942 when they weren't able to reach Moscow. And then others will say that the Germans started losing the war as soon as it started because they just never could have won that war to begin with. Other people will put that changing point into Battle of Kursk. You know, it depends on where you put the turning point of the war. I think Stalingrad is where a lot of people put it, but I mean that's, you know.
So I mean, a lot of those turning points fall after the Lend-Lease program. So like,
well, the Lend-Lease program was effective throughout the war, so it got going. It really started to get going in 1943, 1944, after a lot of these key turning points already happened in the war.
I see.
That's why
Gotcha.
That's why there's really no consensus.
So why did it take so long to like start up? I mean, if we you know, launched the program in like late November 41, why did it take 2 years to get started?
Well, the main problem was delivery routes to the Soviet Union. Because how do you bring all these materials to the Soviet Union from America? And, the main routes were across the North Atlantic Ocean. So like around Norway, where the Germans had a naval base and it was riddled with submarines. So there was an event.
Yeah, that's not a good idea.
Yeah, there was a catastrophe really called the convoy PQ-17, where the Germans sank 24 of 35 Allied ships in this convoy in the Arctic Ocean. So convoys were just being obliterated.
Jesus.
Transferring Lend-Lease materials from the United States and Britain, from the U.S. and Britain to the Soviet Union. So they had to find an alternative route. And that alternative route was through Iran. Funny enough, that was like where the Allies decided would be the safest passage would be through the Middle East, through the Persian Gulf, through Iran. Because you would think the Pacific would be it, but you couldn't really go through the Pacific either because there were all these different obstacles with the Japanese. The Soviet Union,
makes sense.
The Soviet Union and the Japanese weren't at war yet. The Soviet Union didn't declare war on the Japanese until 1945, until the ending of the war, really. But those would be U.S. and British ships who were at war with the Japanese. So it just wouldn't be able to that they couldn't go through that way, that route either. Now, so Iran is kind of settled as the main place, and let's actually put a pin on this because I want to outline some context to pull this back. One of the fronts that is completely forgotten during World War II is the Persian Gulf front. It's forgotten because there weren't really too many casualties and that much heavy fighting in this front. But regardless, the theater was extremely important because of the delivery of war materials to the Soviet Union. And I think when it peaked, the theater had approximately around 65,000 U.S. civilians and 30,000 soldiers stationed there. However, when the U.S. Army began deploying troops to Iran, American policymakers, and the general public really had no knowledge of that region. Like, in the Middle East and the Middle Eastern countries, like the Arab states and Iran, the only people who really had knowledge of those regions in the early 20th century were either people who did business there. A lot of that business was oil, and religious missions and things like that. They're the only people who really had, and that goes for like a lot of parts in the world. The people who mainly had knowledge of China in the 20th century were business people and missionaries, because they're the people who extended out into the world. We didn't really have this robust academic and kind of diplomatic establishment that had all these different policies in all these different parts of the world in this time of of our history. So it was like a whole new thing. The U.S. had engaged in imperial escapades, but it wasn't the British Empire at this point. Now, I think the War Department didn't even have maps of Persia when the decision was made to move into the country. And, the State Department's Division of Near Eastern Affairs had like a staff of 13 people. And I think only 3 of them were able to speak any languages in Iran. Britain, of course, had ruled Iraq as a colony until 1932, and British troops were there until 1937 when they left. but a rebel government in Iraq that was seen as pro-Axis led to the British reoccupation of Iraq in May 1941. Because, remember, World War II, Iraqi oil was very important to the British war effort. So, right after the British occupation of Iraq and the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the British and the Soviets occupied Iran to secure a route for supplies to the Soviet Union from Lend-Lease. So they basically divided the country in half, which is really funny because during World War I, there was an exact plan to do this. So when they were negotiating Sykes-Picot between the British and the French, there was a secret deal going on at the same time with the British and the Russians on what to do with the Persian Empire at the time. And what they were going to do is that they were going to divide Persia from the north, modern day Iran from the north and the south. And when that was over, when the Soviet Union came to power and the Tsarist government fell, the Soviet Union backed out of the deal. They were like, we don't believe in this sort of thing, this imperialism that you're engaged in. We're not doing this. But later on, the Soviet Union obviously expands and does become like an imperial country. And I guess in their mind was for national security interest. But nevertheless, this happens during World War II. The joint British-Russian plans to divide the country. And, Iran was officially neutral during the war. Its monarch, Reza Shah Pahlavi, he was friendly towards the Axis powers. So, or at least he didn't condemn them enough. So he was deposed during, the subsequent occupation, and then he was replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who is AKA the Shah of Iran.
Oh, the Shah.
Yeah. So
that guy.
That's how the Shah comes to power first. The Shah that that's so impactful it was so important to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East from the 50s to the 70s. He comes to power because of World War II, and then after World War II, the Iranians, they elect their own government, and then the CIA overthrows them and puts the Shah back in power.
Yeah.
And the Shah is, he's seen as a puppet because he is a puppet. Now, I guess a treaty was signed, and I have a quote from a historian, T.H. Vale Motor, he calls this the occupation which has officially not an occupation, making Iran a passive, powerless, and resentful partner of the Allies. So, this kind of kicks off, a whole foreign policy debacle that we're still living with now, with Iran and the U.S. having hostile relations. But to go back to World War II, the Americans began arriving during the fall of 1942 at the behest of the British. And at this point, Britain was overextended in India in fighting the war. They needed the U.S. to secure Iran. And, the Soviet Union was already fighting for its very existence on the Eastern Front, so they didn't really have troops to spare. So an agreement was hammered out in which the Americans would take over British control and responsibility of the Trans-Iranian Railway and truck transport of the Lend-Lease supplies to Russia. And the handover responsibility occurred in November of 1942. It was Major General Donald Connolly who was put in charge of what would become the Persian Gulf Command, And then this command eventually totaled 30,000 troops. And then, the Persian Gulf Command, their job was pretty simple. It was to offload weapons and supplies from Iranian ports. And then they had to assemble them because, they weren't sending them fully assembled stuff from the U.S. They had to assemble them in Iran. And then after they assembled them, they would, either fly or transport this stuff from, by truck or by railroad. And they would send everything up north. So, they actually kind of modernize Iran in a large way because they have to make all these factories and all these modern ports to facilitate the transportation of cargo and weapons and supplies from the United States to Russia at the same time. But yeah, they had to make everything and assemble everything in Iran. And, ultimately they deliver more than 5 million tons of weapons and supplies to the Soviet Union from Iran. Most people listening to this will be familiar enough to know that, the major battle, the major war, the most devastating and largest battles of the war, they were all in the Eastern Front of World War II. 80% of the more than 5 million man German military, 80% of their deaths occurred in the Eastern Front. And, during that time period, the Red Army went through a pretty radical transformation. Because just think about it. Before the war, the military was decimated by the Stalin purges. And, like I said earlier, they were losing entire armies in the first year of the war. But as the war progressed, the Red Army arguably becomes the greatest military in the world. So the question is, how much is due to Lend-Lease? And, take my opinion with a grain of salt. There's plenty of people who know a lot more about World War II than I do. But, I was always under the impression that Lend-Lease just shortened the war because, Lend-Lease didn't really impact anything until after 1942, after the Soviets had already won Stalingrad. But, regardless, let's look at the Allies supplied, what the Allies supplied to the Soviets. I pulled this from an article from the National Interest called Lend-Lease Helped Win World War II, but Not on the Eastern Front by Robert Beck-Hussein. And it just outlines pretty much everything that the Allies supplied the Soviet Union during the war. And the Allies supplied more than 12,000 tanks to the Soviet Union. 5,000 came from the UK and Canada and included the Valentine, Churchill, and Matilda tanks. And then the US, for its part, supplied nearly 1,400 M3 Lee tanks and more than 4,000 M4 Shermans. Now, these numbers were small in comparison to the tens of thousands of T-34s produced during the war. The T-34 tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. These tanks were pretty beast. I think we've talked about this in some prior episodes, and as a matter of fact, I think this was one of our first episodes when we talked about Sherman tanks in general, and primarily that episode was focused more around Sherman tanks versus Panzers, but we definitely talked about the T-34s and just in short, these like you said, they built tens of thousands of these, and they're pretty awesome. I think what was interesting that I don't think we've mentioned on the show is that the suspension, the Christie suspension that they run on, was basically inherited from a design of an American who built these M1928 tanks, which they then turned around and sold them to the Red Army without turrets, of course, and they put it down on paper as farm tractors, which is funny. And they basically were able to reverse engineer it and figure out how to make some pretty good suspension, but they really put a spin on it that was pretty awesome. It had a really high sloped armor that was really good against anti-tank weapons. So basically, when you get hit on head on, they just kind of deflect rather than just totally nailing you. And yeah, I mean, they're relatively quick, very, strongly armored. And they just made a shit ton of them too. They made really, really good tanks. Let's just put it that way. It definitely way better than some of the tanks that they were getting through the Lend-Lease programs, like the Valentines and the Matildas, from Britain, which had really small turrets and underpowered cannons. And, I think they probably weren't very, this is actually hard to say. They might have been outmatched in tank combat with German panzers, but so were the Shermans, and, just a shit ton of Shermans were able to overwhelm a bunch of really good panzers. So, quality over quantity over quality in that respect,
Yeah, well, another problem with the Sherman was that it had narrow treads, and it made it less mobile in the mud. And then Shermans also consumed a lot of fuel,
which was also in not very high supply.
Yeah, but it funny because Laners had standardized the width of the Sherman treads in the war to ensure that Shermans would fit into ocean transports when they would across, when they would be sent to supply the British and the Soviets. And that aspect of the treads made them undesirable to a lot of Soviet tank operators.
Yeah, because they were so narrow. Yeah.
But so yeah, I mean the Soviets had their own tanks that were really good. Especially the T-34. So a lot of the U.S. the Western tanks, I mean, they were definitely used, but it's hard to really grade the impact that they had during the war, or at least, I personally can't. So and then there was also the aircraft as well that was sent over. And, what's interesting is that during World War II, the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, they had pretty different approaches to air power during the war. The West relied more on strategic bombing deep into the Axis territory, bombing like oil fields in Romania and bombing cities and not the Soviet Union. They preferred aircraft suited toward striking targets on the battlefield. So I'm going to quote from this article: the armored was it Ilyushin? Yeah, the armored Ilyushin ground attack plane embodied this different concept, and the Soviets produced more than 36,000 during the war, more than any other military aircraft in history. The Soviets were thus disappointed in the 4,700 U.S. P-39 Air Cobras, although they were effective, and 3,000 British Hawker Hurricanes supplied under Lend-Lease. Far more consequential were the thousands of Western transport aircraft, which bolstered the Red Army's logistical backbone, and the A-20 Havoc light bombers, which contributed to the Soviets' offensive maneuvers.
It's interesting that you point this out, because I didn't dive too deeply into the aircraft this time around for the Lend-Lease, but one thing that I did come across that's related to aircraft is that a lot of the Soviet aircraft flew on lower octane fuel than, like American or British aircraft. And what was pretty important about that was that we would ship over super high octane fuel as part of the Lend-Lease, like part of the other shit that we would send over. And they would cut our fuel with their fuel to make lower octane fuel that can run their planes. So while the planes that we sent over might not have been the ones that they wanted, they certainly used our planes. The fuel that we were providing the planes that they did use a lot, like the Ilyushin 2s, those ground attack planes, they can't fly without fuel. And we certainly were giving them a shit ton of it. And since we were sending really high octane stuff, they're able to kind of spread that out and make that last longer versus the planes that we were sending over that were running on high octane fuels, which would consumed more. So, it's somewhat related in that respect. Aircraft were definitely super important during World War II. And I think that you can't underwrite the contributions that the Lend-Lease program had for aircraft, at least from the fuel perspective.
Yeah, I mean, besides aircraft and besides tanks, there was everything else that was the most significant chunk of Lend-Lease. So, things like trucks, fuel, clothing, guns, ammunition, metals, radios,
explosives,
industrial equipment, everything that would, soften the war's blow to the Soviet Union's industrial and agriculture base.
Yeah. Which is why it makes kind of the topic of like, did Lend-Lease help the Soviet Union win the war or not? It makes it kind of complicated because, like we've pointed out, the Soviets had a wide range of weapons that were really good for use on the Eastern Front.
It's kind of, and just one comparison, it's kind of hard to measure the contribution of U.S. weapons right now in Ukraine because a lot of the stuff that the Ukrainians are using are are stuff that's made in Ukrainian factories and from the Soviet Union that they've modified. Like the Neptune missiles, they're not American missiles.
No, they're based on Russian missiles, right? But I think what makes it kind of difficult to have this, like to say definitively whether or not the Lend-Lease program actually made a difference is just because there's so many factors involved, right? We talked about T-34s, we talked about submachine guns, something that we didn't talk too much about that definitely has an impact, but, hard to measure how that impact was, right? So they didn't like our tanks, or their tanks were better, but their tanks really sucked because they had really bad radios. The Soviet Union, their industry was lacking in two really big places that I want to talk about. One of them is radio, and the other one is trucks. And this is something the U.S. did really, really well in. On the point of radios, the radios for the tanks were, in the Soviet Union were very, very complicated, and they failed like a lot. And when they did fail, it was actually super hard for them to get back up and running. And this is, I guess where we would pin the start of modern warfare, and communication is everything. So if you can't talk and communicate among, the other tank operators, it's kind of hard to maneuver. And so once the Lend-Lease was approved and they started getting getting the US radios, these tank operators immediately start noticing how bad their own units were. And there's like a lot of people that write about that. And, to compensate for the lack of like quality in certain things like radios and trucks, the Soviet Union needed to produce huge amounts of lower quality alternatives, to these imports, which was totally unfeasible because there was a lot of questions about the Soviet Union's economy in the first place while this was happening. And Lend-Lease in many ways, I think, kind of helped stabilize the economy. The Russian economy collapsed during World War I, and there were projections already during World War II that the Soviet Union was, at risk of collapse. Now, exactly when it would collapse was obviously impossible to know. It was anyone's guess. But I think definitely Lend-Lease helped to stave it off because, to your point, to your reading of it, maybe it helped, save a couple of years on the war. But, the imports alone from this Lend-Lease program were close to 5% of the Soviet Union's gross national product. That's a lot. That's a lot, in my mind at least, that this helped the Soviet Union to allocate those resources that they would have been using towards creating inferior radios, as an example, elsewhere, up to and including for, like civilian use. But one of the biggest ones, in my opinion, that I read a lot about was trucks. Trucks don't sound sexy. I mean, it's not like a tank or an airplane, but they had a very significant impact on the Eastern Front. And, the reason why is because unless the Soviet Union was able to completely capture like a railway system, like an enemy railway system, and they'd have to completely capture it totally intact, by the way, right? There was no there was no way to move troops and material en masse forward into enemy territory other than trucks, right? It's a little difficult for you to capture an enemy railway system. For the most part, if the enemy feels like they're going to be overtaken, they just blow it up. So these trucks become really vital for this Eastern Front, and U.S. trucks were super high quality, both in quantity. The sheer numbers of the imports made, I think, a huge impact. I read that Studebakers, one of the types of trucks that they sent over, carried 50% more tonnage on average versus similar Soviet Union trucks, and they were considered to be better, and they definitely lasted longer than Soviet Union trucks. So much so that by the end of the war, 2 out of every 3 trucks in the Soviet Union were foreign built, including like 400,000 cargo trucks and 47,000 Willys Jeeps. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the Soviet Union got more trucks from the US than the Germans were able to build for themselves. And kind of understanding that logistics is so important, and we can see this playing out right now during, the Ukraine crisis. Moving shit around is so important. It's not just the guns that you're firing. It's also like, how do you get things to the front line? And how do you move people around quickly? And I think that these trucks definitely enabled the Soviet Union to act more offensively by quickly moving troops and supplies deeper and deeper into Nazi territory. And I think without them, the Soviet Union might still have been able to win, but I just think, like you think, it would have taken much longer, and it would have definitely claimed more Russian lives.
There's this video I'm trying to find it real quick, but there's this video of like old World War II footage of American trucks driving through the water, and they basically turn in, they're amphibious trucks, and they basically turn into boats. They're it's a pretty cool video. I forgot what truck it is, but I don't know. I'm going to try to find that. But yeah, obviously trucks and all the other stuff is very underrated, even if it's not as sexy as, tanks and artillery and planes. Now, let's talk about let's start comparing this to, modern day world. Because we wanted to compare Lend-Lease of the old day to the latest bill that's being voted on right now.
Lend-Lease 2.0?
Lend-Lease 2.0, or what, HR 7691, Additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act 2022. So $40 billion. What's going on here? You've read deeper into this bill than I have. I've kind of skimmed through the top, but you actually read the entire bill. What's going on here?
So yeah, a lot. Before we get into that, though, I do want to make a distinction, and I think it's kind of cool and a good segue from our discussion on Lend-Lease from before. When you brought up the idea to talk about Lend-Lease, I was like, great, that's in the news. There's some headlines and shit. And I actually made the mistake of thinking the new Lend-Lease program, which was signed on by President Biden on May 9th, was the same as this HR 7691, the Additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act. I don't know why I mistake the two. I think they just both sounded super similar, and I just wasn't paying attention. And so I went down 2 completely separate rabbit holes. But I want to stick with the Lend-Lease before we talk about that bill that's not yet through the Senate, because a lot of the things you just brought up about Lend-Lease sound interesting in relation to the Lend-Lease of today. So one of the things that jumped out at me was when you were saying that at the time Russia was losing, or at least it looked like they were going to lose. And even you admitted, like, if you had lived back then, you probably would have went under the assumption that Russia was going to lose. And the fear was that all those weapons would just end up going to the Nazis. I feel like that's kind of similar right now. I feel like that's a very reasonable fear for a lot of people to have right now, that we're going to do this Lend-Lease to Ukraine, whereby we're just giving a bunch of weapons, highly effective and potentially even, classified ones that could fall under, Russian hands or something like that. And maybe they reverse engineer them and learn shit about it, right? Obviously, we're not going to give them any of the good shit, but you kind of get the idea. And we're coming off the tail of, the pullout of Afghanistan and seeing the Taliban basically scoop up all of our hardware. And I think it leaves kind of a bad taste in people's mouths.
Yeah, it's, the Taliban, the picture of them posting a flag, the Taliban flag, mocking the flags put up in Iwo Jima.
Yeah, but they're like all decked out in our like armor and shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty hard image to get out of your head, but I think most Americans have forgotten about that by now, to be completely honest. I don't think most Americans have like a very faint recollection of the Afghanistan pullout and how just
at this point
crazy that all was. And it's kind of funny because those Afghanistan episodes last year, they kind of like greatly increased our audience volume. Like, I think they kind of doubled our audience since then. And I mean, I don't want to get into the full thing. I mean, you can listen to those episodes, but the Afghanistan war was a complete boondoggle, and the Afghan army was a giant charade. Like there wasn't an Afghan army. It was all on paper. Now, the difference is that someone like me, after seeing the shit show in Afghanistan, kind of expected the same thing to happen in Ukraine, where all the military aid we gave them would just be was just gonna be for nothing. I still think it's for nothing, by the way, but at least the Ukrainians are fighting. Like, there's actually an army there.
Yeah,
and they're certain units seem to be heavily entrenched and not willing to surrender at all. So I guess in that regard,
they're doing a good job, all things considered.
Yeah. So in that regard, they're still, they're not. There's not a ghost army, is what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way.
Yeah.
Blame it on the COVID.
Yeah.
But yeah, they exist.
So like, in this case, if we've just signed a Lend-Lease into action, and I've been reading a little bit about how people are talking about how, or at least the Russian talking point now is that we're trying to debt trap the Ukrainian people by just sending them over a bunch of loan military hardware, because technically it's a lease and they have to either give it back, but a lot of them are going to get blown up by Russia. So
I personally, I don't agree with that. I don't think that the U.S. is trying to debt trap them, because
I don't either. That's just
the reason why is because I'm perfectly willing to believe that the U.S. is not responsible enough to expect loans back, or they're perfectly fine with shitting out money and putting it in a dumpster and lighting it on fire. You know what I mean? Like, they don't give a fuck.
Yeah.
Like, they'll just print it. Like, they give a shit about the foreign aid they give out.
We'll talk about some foreign aid here in a second, but I guess the only thing that I didn't really get too much of a chance to read up on, and I was hoping that maybe you had, was after the war, we were doing this Lend-Lease program. Did the Soviet Union and did Britain and other people, did they end up paying us back for that shit?
I don't think the Soviet Union did.
So, yeah, I mean, that kind of further solidifies my point that I don't think this is a debt trap. Especially for stuff like bullets, like when we're sending bullets or missiles, expendable items, fuel, we're not expecting them to give it back. That shit, it's spent, like you used it, it's gone. And I don't think it's also reasonable to think of hey, you just finished up a pretty brutal war. I know you got to rebuild everything, but you owe us billions of dollars for all that shit that you that we lent you. I just don't see the U.S. ever, calling that debt. I just feel like it would be in bad taste, but also just like how how do you possibly do that?
Well, after Ukraine's pretty much a shattered country at this point. I mean, how would they expect them to be able to? After this war, Ukraine's going to be financially dependent on the West.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, they're going to lose, major industrial zones in the East. And, there's so much rebuilding to be done. The country's basically is on the way of turning into a failed state. So I think it's going to be completely financially dependent on the EU and the United States, kind of like how Bosnia is right now. So no, I don't think that there's an expectation for them to. What are they going to pay back the West with? Agriculture, with wheat, for the next 50 years?
Yeah, I don't think that's feasible. All right, my last point on this thing is we saw how, at least, we've made the argument that the Lend-Lease program benefited the Soviet Union and to a certain extent contributed to their win. Now, totally different scenario here, right? And Ukraine is an epic underdog in this particular battle. But we have seen how they are able to employ the use of our technology, in particular, like those Javelin missiles, to great effect. So, do you think a Lend-Lease program would help Ukraine, or at the very least, maybe not to win, but at the very least to hold off the Russians long enough for them to, come to the table with better, with a better, more leverage, right?
I don't know. I personally don't think that it will, because we spoke about this last week when you were talking about, U.S. support. All the bigger stuff, all the heavy weapons that they need, it's going to be really hard to get them to the guys in Donbass who are currently entrenched in the battle. And
it was hard to get stuff to the Soviet Union, and we figured it out.
Well, most of the stuff that they're going to be able to get things to them, but it's mostly going to be small arms stuff, guns and fuel and javelins, the small arrow type stuff, not the heavy artillery, and the large,
I don't know. I was reading that M1 Abrams, Bradley armored fighting vehicles, all that shit is on the table for this Lend-Lease.
Yeah, and maybe Russia runs out of missiles and they can't target them on their way. That's definitely a possibility.
Yeah,
or Russia runs out of munitions to target equipment. And I threw out the theory that one of the objectives of the U.S. of throwing all this support and all these weapons into Western Ukraine was that it would force the Russians to use its munitions to destroy this equipment before it gets to the West, knowing that if they put this, it will force the Russians to, use their better missiles and their better equipment to destroy it. So maybe that's a possibility that they run out of that. And then, that's something that the U.S. planners could be doing. It's possible, right? Because anything's possible.
It totally is, but maybe we're giving them too much credit.
Yeah, maybe we're giving them too much credit, and it was just a complete MIC cash grab, which is also very likely. Maybe it's a little bit of both. That's how you justify the cash grab.
Right. Speaking of cash grabs, now I think that's a really good segue for us to talk about this other thing, which is HR 7691, officially known as Additional Ukraine Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2022. Now, this is the $40 billion one that just passed in the House, being held up in the Senate. I think Rand Paul is the one that's holding it up right here. But I read it. I actually read the damn bill. And I went so far as to put it into a spreadsheet, because I don't know if you've ever read these bills before, especially appropriations bills, but the way that they write it, I think they're intentionally writing it for you not like if you're breezing past it, you're not going to really know exactly how much money is going to what.
Yeah, I've read these bills
like
before.
They'll show you a little line item.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're super annoying.
They're meant to be very tedious to read. I think they're purposely.
Yeah.
There's not like a line item. It's not
a spreadsheet.
Yeah. I mean, it would save
way.
so much time if. I think that's why Congress people don't read them too.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you fully. But
you think Congress people would have a staff member who would just take these out and be like, okay, go read this bill, put everything important into a spreadsheet. This is why, you're hired on my team to put this information in a line item so I could easily glance at this, and I don't have to spend 8 hours reading this. It'll take me an hour going through the spreadsheet that you prepare for me. But that doesn't.
Well, thankfully, this bill wasn't that long where it took me that long. But I acted as that staffer, and I literally put it into a spreadsheet because I could not wrap my head around how, just reading it. So you asked, where is this money going to? I did a lot of work on this. And speaking of cash grabs, the majority of this is going to the Department of Defense. This is $40 billion and $20 billion or a little bit over it. Just over 50% of it is going specifically to the Department of Defense. There's 13.1 billion going to something called the bilateral economic assistance. There's 5.2 billion going to the Department of State, and then everything else is in the millions or hundreds of millions. But as far as percentages go, it's really, really small percentages for everything else. But those are the big three that are on there. And there's this one monster line item, and it's called operations and maintenance. And it comes in at just over $15 billion. I'm going to read it for you. It's for the replacement of defense articles from the stocks of the Department of Defense and for reimbursement for defense services of the Department of Defense and military education and training provided to the government of Ukraine or to foreign countries that have provided support to Ukraine at the request of the United States. So, yeah, all those javelins and other hardware we're sending to Ukraine, they got to be replenished. So this is what's paying for that. So far, the Department of Defense has sent 5,500 javelins. Those are the anti-tank missiles, and about 1,400 Stinger anti-aircraft missiles into Ukraine. And according to something I read, that's 1/3 of the total inventory of Javelin missiles and 1/4 of our stockpile of Stinger missiles. And they're not cheap either. Javelin costs about $178,000 a pop. That's including the launch system and the missile. And each replacement missile, each extra round, is about $78,000. Cost of a Stinger missile is about $120,000, including the launch system and the missile. Each replacement costs about $38,000. So you can imagine these, the numbers on this add up pretty quick. And with this much stock depleted, it's obvious that the U.S. isn't just going to sit around and be content with having fewer missiles. So while I may be particularly against increasing military expenditure, I'm not exactly surprised that so much of this aid package isn't going directly to Ukraine or humanitarian efforts. It's going to buying more weapons.
We need to do a comparison on the cost of Russian items and the cost of U.S. items, because this bill, $40 billion, the Russian military budget is what, $58 billion? I think it's $58 billion.
Basically most of their entire annual budget.
Yeah. So it's just the U.S. war machine is obviously greater and larger than the Russian war machine, but it's just crazy that the Russians obviously have a pretty big stockpile of weapons, and they're not building them for they're not building a missile for $78,000 a pop, or maybe they are, and maybe I don't know.
We'll find out.
We got to look into it, but I imagine that it's just what they're building is not as expensive. But okay, so back to this bill. There's a $13 billion in bilateral economic assistance. What is that? Does it outline what that is exactly?
Yeah. So that's one of the headers of a section of the bill that I'm not going to pretend to understand the meaning of, but I can tell you what was included in it to get to that number. So there was a line item for international disaster assistance. It's about $4.3 billion. It's one of those that's like good till it's gone. So basically we'll spend it all. And it reads, to respond to humanitarian needs in Ukraine and in countries impacted by the situation in Ukraine, including the provision of emergency food and shelter, and for assistance for other vulnerable populations and communities, including through local and international non-governmental organizations. So for this one, I think on the face of it, this one is both the most helpful for the Ukrainian people and potentially also the most controversial. Like food and shelter for vulnerable populations should be priority number one, in my opinion, if we're going to be giving aid to Ukraine at all. People really need this. And if we're going to be spending money at all, I'm the least opposed to spending it on this in particular. But I think the NGO part is, where that's what's got like the internet conspiracies bubbling right now. Someone's got to be on the ground distributing this aid. And honestly, if it's between an NGO and the government doing it, I think I'm on the NGO side, unfortunately. I can see how people will presume that it will line someone's pocket. I get it, but I just think I'm less pessimistic about it. One counterexample to this that I'll willingly, open up is just that after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, there was a lot of aid that was, sent over to Puerto Rico in the form of supplies, and a lot of them mysteriously vanished, only to later be discovered as having been hoarded by some piece of shit mayors, and they went to waste. We're talking about like water and baby food and all kinds of shit that was super useful, but they were just hoarding them for themselves and keeping them in shipping containers. And that was totally shitty. But what was the alternative? Like not send any aid because some shitty mayors are probably going to scoop some off the top? Like, I don't think that's an option. I think there's no way to tell how this aid gets around until it gets around. And I think I'd rather try to get it to who needs it and risk that some of it doesn't make its way to the people than not try at all. So if there's one thing on this bill that I'm like cool with, it's probably this one.
Yeah, I mean, aid always sounds nice, but a lot of times foreign aid is like, we're going to build a school for these girls, and then that school ends up being like a tent in the middle of the desert, especially and it costs $50 million, and it's just a lot of it is just mispriced, and it's overpriced, and it's goes out to pay contracts and rich people, and that's the fear. Like the billions that are missing that have been misappropriated in the Iraq War and the Afghan War. That's the reason why Rand Paul, he blocked the bill, because he wanted the bill to be he wanted the spending to be monitored, and
right. And I fully support that. I think that's a good idea.
That's the least that we could do. But it's like, no, we need to pass this out as quickly as possible and not monitor spending, because
I get it.
Then we'll get into trouble.
It's a tricky situation, but like if there's one thing on this bill that I'm like cool with, it's probably that one. There's also a much larger $8.7 billion line item for, quote, economic support fund. And that one reads, for assistance for Ukraine and countries impacted by the situation in Ukraine, including for programs to combat human trafficking, of which up to 760 million may be made available to prevent and respond to food insecurity. So again, like the last one, if we're going to spend any money, this one seems like a good thing to spend it on. But I was a little bit curious about how they're just distributing this larger chunk of money. In particular, they specifically call out only $760 million for food insecurity. Now, human trafficking is a problem, but I feel like they should have flipped the amounts here, where more money went to food. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand the implications of human trafficking in Ukraine, or how much we need to spend on it. That's not my lane, and I'm not going to play that route. But I have been reading a lot of articles outlining the increased risk of human trafficking in Ukraine as the war goes on, and I definitely sympathize with that. But something that just doesn't sit well with me about this one line, it's that they very specifically earmark a relatively low amount for food insecurity. And that's just something I understand tacitly. And that would impact millions of people, including people not even in Ukraine, because, food insecurity has been a problem during the war in Ukraine because Ukraine's the breadbasket of Europe, right? So I don't know. It's just a little weird for me. But the last bit on this that I found a little bit unsettling was that both of these line items under the bilateral economic assistance is directly appropriated to Joe Biden. So directly appropriated to the president specifically. And I'm not making a political statement here. Like, regardless of who the president is, I'm not super comfortable with one person calling the shots unilaterally on how much money is spent and on what. I mean, sure, the aid hypothetically would move faster if just one person called the shots. I couldn't imagine our Congress having to debate on every nickel and dime and where it's going. But it is a lot of money, and that could easily be misappropriated, and not even for nefarious reasons. It could just be an accident.
My son Hunter.
Maybe I'm kind of on the.
He's new director of agriculture of Ukraine. He's good at that.
No, but you know what I mean, right? It doesn't have to be nefarious for it to go wrong. So maybe I'm kind of on the Rand Paul route here. Just a little bit more oversight would be useful.
A little more oversight. And I would have to say, with a completely reconstruction of the system that prioritizes oversight as a fundamental contingent on providing any type of foreign assistance or aid. Or what are some other takeaways that you have from the bill? I'm starting to my COVID is
COVID's acting up.
My COVID's acting up, so I can only give another 10 to 15 minutes.
All right, cool. Well, there's this one other big line item, and also this one is directly appropriated to the president, and it's called Foreign Military Financing Program. And this one's for a total of $4 billion, or just 10% of the entire package. It's massive. And it reads, for assistance for Ukraine and countries impacted by the situation in Ukraine during fiscal years 2022 and 2023, funds made available under the heading Foreign Military Financing Program in this act and prior acts, making appropriations for the Department of State, foreign operations, and related programs may be utilized by Ukraine for the procurement of defense articles, defense services, or design and construction services that are not sold by the United States government under the Arms Export Control Act. Okay, I think this one is worth taking a few minutes to talk about. The TLDR on this one is the government gives Ukraine cash to buy whatever the hell weapons or services it wants from basically whomever it wants. There's a couple of asterisks on it. You can't buy shit that's under the Arms Export Control Act. They can't use it to buy nukes, as an example, right? But this is a grant. It's not Lend-Lease, right? So it's just money that we're giving them, and we don't expect this money back at all. And so basically, we're giving Zelensky a credit card and telling him to buy whatever he needs for the war. And this is not new for the US. We do this a lot, especially with countries in the Middle East and in Central Asia. And the basic idea for this is pretty simple. So rather than us figuring out what a country needs to defend itself, we let them pick it out themselves. It's like the gift card of military aid. And it's better in many ways than just sending our own hardware over and just like, here's a tank, right? Especially in countries like Ukraine, where they're more accustomed to like this old Soviet hardware. They can go out on the market and just buy the stuff that they know how to use and that they want or that they think that they need. Now, we don't have to train them on shit with this money. And we also don't have to put ourselves in direct risk to ship it, train them, and troubleshoot it for them. Now, of course, countries often just use that money to buy our shit anyway, because they want it, which just puts the money back into our economy, or rather puts the money back into the military-industrial complex. But in many ways, this can be no different than just, giving the MIC more money in just like a roundabout way, because Zelensky's just going to end up buying a bunch more javelins from us because he likes them.
Yeah.
So, what do you think, man? What's your take on this aid package to Ukraine so far?
I mean, I think what I said earlier, that it's it's mainly going to accomplish, the main accomplishments of this bill is going to be helping executives at Lockheed Martin purchase their vacation homes or further vacation homes. I think I made a joke last episode about, buying a ski house along with their beach house. I think that's going to be the main objection, or the main fallout from this is just objective. Yeah. It's just I don't think that this aid package is going to. Maybe I'm completely wrong about this, and I've been wrong about a lot of stuff in this war. But I personally just don't think that the war is this aid package is really going to impact the outcome of the war at the very least. I'm not saying that Ukraine's going to lose, but I'm saying that I don't think that it's going to impact the outcome of the war. But I think that the U.S., the goal of the United States has been to keep the war going on until the Russian economy implodes. And I mean, right now the Russian economy has not imploded, and it could implode, but right now it doesn't show too many signs that it's going to implode. So there's more signs of European economies about to get into some real dicey areas. But I mean, who knows? Maybe this all changes.
Maybe, man. I mean, I'm a bit on the fence myself about this particular bill. And, we've spent hours over the last few months discussing and debating this war in particular. And obviously, I'm not going to rehash it all again. But what I will say is that I'm sympathetic to the people of Ukraine, not its government or, any of the far-right crazies that fight in the Azov regiment. I do think that the people of Ukraine deserve some help. And, my hot take is that, after reading this, we can clearly afford it somehow, especially after seeing so much garbage in this bill that we're willing to spend money on. If we clearly have the money somewhere. Where I'm having trouble is if we're going to spend $40 billion, this bill is not how I would spend it in particular. I'd probably direct that money more towards helping Ukrainian people rather than lining the pockets of the MIC. But obviously that's an oversimplification, and I'm not going to pretend to know the best way to spend $40 billion on helping people in Ukraine. I just don't feel super comfortable about the way that this bill is earmarked. It just feels like a lot of money going to the MIC without like a very clear cost to benefit analysis behind it, right? I'm not seeing that very clearly. And of course, it also bugs me to see how readily we are willing to spend money on the MIC, under the guise of helping Ukraine, that makes me feel uncomfortable. I just feel like there's so many other things we could spend the money on, including in Ukraine in many ways. But also, there's plenty of things that we could spend the money on domestically and even internationally. We had a pretty interesting chat in our Patreon Slack. One of our Patreon members brought up the fact that, the James Webb Telescope costs us $10 billion. And that's going to help us with such incredible science. The Apollo program, when it started, if you adjust it for inflation, costed us $11 billion a year over 12 years, of course. But it also employed like 400,000 people and, looped in like 20,000 universities. So imagine what we can do with that money today. I mean, by today's standards, we can probably do 13 Mars missions at like $2.9-3 billion a pop.
Isn't the estimate for going to Mars only like $2 billion or $3 billion?
Yeah. I mean, the current Mars missions that we've done so far, with rovers is $2.9 billion.
Yeah.
And God knows what Elon Musk is up to on his front. But, just the costs seem like they're going down in general. And I'm not saying that going to Mars is better than helping the people of Ukraine. I'm just kind of putting it into perspective, and I mean, think about like world hunger as an example. And speaking of Elon Musk specifically, the UN proposed to Elon Musk, who like went on Twitter to be like, hey, tell me how I can use my billions of dollars to help world hunger. Well, they gave him a proposition and they said, hey, you can end famine for 22 million people around the world for 1 year at the low cost of $6 billion. At $6 billion, we could do that every year for the next 7 years. So that could even include the people of Ukraine, right? For way cheaper. We can turn this inwards, right? There's a lot of, isolationists that are like, why are we, throwing our money at other people? We got our own problems. I hear you. I feel that. The cheapest free plan for college in the world, in the US, I should say, would cost us about $27.8 billion. And there's a lot of different plans, and someone's going to write in the comments somewhere like, oh, that's not the cost of free education, blah, blah, blah. Just read into it. I promise. There's options, very cheap. But at $25,000 a pop on the high end, we could do something else. We could say, hey, 1.6 million homes get solar panels. That's a lot of people, and that's a lot of clean energy production. If we're talking about energy in general, the largest clean fusion energy experiment, the ITER, that plant cost $22 billion. So a little over half of what we're spending on this bill. You can even say, hey, the part that we're spending on the military. So we could build one of those. Or we can spend the whole $40 billion. And I bet in the next, couple of years, maybe less than a decade, we could probably get fusion up and running. And that could make limitless clean energy. And that would be very useful for the whole world. Not to mention it would make us incredibly powerful as a nation to have fusion energy. And that's just what I was able to Google in 15 minutes, right? Like there's probably a million things that you can do with, there's at least 40 billion things that you can do with $40 billion, right? So yeah, man, I mean, I'm not saying no.
Or you don't have to do anything with the 40.
It's just like,
or in my opinion, you don't do anything with the $40 billion, and you don't just you don't pretend like the $40 billion just came out of nowhere from a leprechaun's chest. It's $40 billion that taxpayers are paying or through inflation. So I mean, that's my option. Is just stop the reckless spending in general. And now it's like a debate. Oh, it's only $40 billion to Ukraine. Well, think about, we can use that $40 billion for this project or that project. My opinion is or where I come from is this: let's just not spend the $40 billion because we don't have it.
I mean, yeah, that's obviously
another
option to go with as well.
Another hot take.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's obvious, but like, look, I get it. Ukraine needs some help. I just wish we would help them in better ways. I don't know what those ways are in particular. I'm not like an expert in this way, but I do know that this current bill doesn't sound great, in my opinion, because I feel like it's just giving money to Lockheed Martin, and that's it.
I agree with you. So I had another segment, but it's going to take too long to go over right now, so maybe we'll save it.
Okay.
But it was more about just about the current situation in Ukraine right now and the war effort. But I read an article from Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis, which I'll post, which is really good. I wanted to go over this, but it's getting late right now. So I'll leave this article if any of you all are interested in it. And then anything else you want to add to this episode?
No, man.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening to another episode of Bro History. Thank you for bearing with me today. I do appreciate it. And we'll see you next week. I will be in Puerto Rico, so I'll be doing an episode live with Danny, not over the internet, and should be really fun. I think we're going to be doing the Spanish-American War, some classic history stuff in honor of being in Puerto Rico, and we're excited to do it. So if you want to support the show, rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to support our show. You can also join us on our Patreon and get access to our Slack account. All right, everyone. Peace.
Peace.